Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
Is our marriage going to fail? Or will we save him? Today's story has a similar plot. Enjoy watching. My name is Mike Adams, and my psychiatrist suggested I keep this journal for my thoughts and feelings. I had just gone through a traumatic divorce and was having a hard time coping with it. The doctor told me to tell my story, including what I was thinking and feeling at the time. He explained that this would help me deal with my trauma. It helped, and after that, journaling simply became a daily habit. Let me start by saying that I feel like I am nothing more than a sad divorce statistic. I caught my wife, Carrie, cheating, and now I'm divorced. I suppose it must have mattered that her lover, my boss Justin Bosner, was blackmailing her, but for me, it didn't matter in the slightest. I couldn't get the image of them having out of my head. Apparently, Justin got my wife drunk at a company party I couldn't attend and took advantage of her. He then took pictures and used them to force her to have with him several times. I'm also on the crime stats because I beat the crap out of him and got arrested. Luckily, I had a great lawyer, my brother Tom. He was able to prove my temporary insanity, and I was acquitted. Then my former boss tried to sue me for damages. When the jury heard the whole story, they did not award him any damages. Then I sued him for destroying my marriage. This time, the jury found him guilty, and I was awarded 6 figures in damages. I then sued our mutual employer for not following the morals clause in the employee handbook. I won a 7-figure settlement. Financially, I came out of this mess smelling like a rose, but I was still divorced and single. Carrie was the love of my life for 8 years. Life was as close to perfection as any husband could expect from his wife. It was only by chance that I found out what she and my boss were doing. One day, when Carrie's phone rang and she wasn't in the room, I answered the call. I picked up the phone, and before I could say a word, I heard the voice on the other end say, "I can't wait to have you." I immediately recognized my boss's voice. I was so shocked that I just hung up. A few minutes later, he called back, and my wife answered. I could tell by the look on her face that she was upset about the call, but eventually, she just responded, "Okay." That evening, Carrie said she wanted to visit a friend. I said I was fine with it. We didn't have kids, so there was no problem if either of us wanted to go out. I suppose at this point I should introduce myself. I'm Michael Adams, an accountant at a large firm. Most people call me Mike. I'm good at what I do, but I can't say that my work really excites me. My wife, Carrie, is a dental hygienist at a local dentist. I think most people would say she was more cute than beautiful, but to me, she was the most beautiful woman I have ever known. Of course, I'm biased. I fell madly in love with her from the moment I first saw her. But after that phone call, I began to doubt whether I even knew my wife. Suddenly, she wasn't as beautiful as I thought. I began to wonder if anything about our 3-year marriage was real. At that moment, I had to find out if she was really cheating on me. When my wife left, I immediately got into my car and followed her until she stopped at a motel. I watched as she walked to the door and knocked. When the door opened, I saw my boss there, wrapped only in a towel. He grabbed my wife and pulled her to him. She pushed him away but entered the room. What could my wife see in this guy? He was fat and bald. I waited about 15 minutes and then walked to the door. I knocked and said in a fake voice, "Receptionist. There may be a problem in your room." A few moments later, Justin opened the door, and I rushed inside. I found my wife on the bed without clothes. Horror flashed in her eyes when she saw that it was me. "Oh God," she screamed, "Mike, it's not what it looks like." I didn't want to be here, but I had no choice. After that, I set to work on my boss. I beat the crap out of him. I then turned to my wife, who by then was in shock. "You said you had no choice. Now here's something about which you actually have a choice, the choice to go home or not. I strongly recommend that you don't." With this final warning, I left the room and headed home. Once there, I poured myself a glass of scotch and quickly downed it. Then I poured myself another and settled into my lounge chair in the living room. About 30 minutes later, there was a knock on the front door. I knew who it was. It was the police. After confirming who I was, I was handcuffed and taken to the county jail. I've heard stories about how hard it can be inside. A reasonable person would have been scared, but I wasn't scared. I was still so angry that I didn't care about anything or anyone. Unfortunately, someone decided he was going to make me his target. I beat him so badly that they had to take him to the county hospital. Luckily for me, there was a security camera in the cell, and it clearly showed that another prisoner started the fight. According to the police, I was simply defending myself. That night, I did a double. Both men I beat had to go to the hospital. In Justin's case, they had to remove one of his private parts, and they weren't sure the other one would ever work properly. I was glad that this probably wouldn't produce any future monsters to bother women. The funny thing is, I'm not a fighter. I'm not the biggest guy. However, when I was little, my father taught me and my brothers to box, but other than fighting my brothers, I'd never been in a real fight. Despite all the pain I caused my boss, it was nothing compared to my pain. The woman I loved more than anyone in the world proved to me that she was nothing more than a cheating liar. Carrie tried to see or call me over the next few days, but I shut her out and tried to bury my pain. I never wanted to be hurt this much again. When my brother arrived, I filled him in on what had happened. He quickly negotiated my release on bail and then took me home to stay with him and his wife, Susan. They were very kind to me, but I was in so much pain that I was a complete. Finally, one evening, Susan pulled me aside and said, "Mike, I know you're hurt, but your brother and I are not to blame. If you're going to be a complete, you might as well go home to your cheating wife or get a hotel room." I apologized, and from that day on, I started thinking and doing the right thing again. My sister-in-law and my brother were my safe haven, and I treated them as such. Tom filed the divorce papers for me and simultaneously filed a lawsuit against my employer. A few days later, my former boss sued me for the injuries I caused him. Tom was smart. He obtained a stay of trial against me pending a decision on the criminal charges. Once I was found not guilty due to temporary insanity, Tom turned his attention to my boss. Justin grinned as the trial began. He thought he was going to get a little richer at my expense. However, my former boss had no idea how deep my brother dug for information. By the time the criminal case against me was completed, Tom had found several former employees of the firm who confirmed that Justin had done the same to them. As I mentioned, when the trial was over, the jury awarded me damages. Of course, Justin was fired immediately, but that wasn't the worst thing for him. He was arrested for rape. The problem with the case against Justin was that there was no physical evidence. However, 6 women testified against him, telling their stories. I didn't follow the progress of the case because I was completely absorbed in my divorce. I remember reading that he was found guilty of something else, but it wasn't rape. It didn't matter to me other than that he was going to jail. I know that Carrie was called as a witness and was, in fact, present every day of Justin's trial. I remember exactly that everyone was very disappointed that he only got 7 years. Even though it was proven that Carrie was and then blackmailed, I could not overcome it. All I could think about was my wife and Justin in bed. So, I filed for divorce. I tried to look at it from Carrie's point of view, but I couldn't. If she had just trusted me and told me the truth, I could have dealt with Justin. But she didn't, and the fact that she kept coming back for more made me think that maybe, deep down, Carrie liked what she was doing. My last divorce hearing was incredibly traumatic. Carrie was there with her lawyer, and she kept trying to talk to me privately before the hearing. I made sure this didn't happen. Throughout the hearing, Carrie continued to try to catch my eye. The only time I looked at her, there was a pleading look in her eyes, but I was in too much pain to pay attention to it. When the judge granted our divorce, Carrie became hysterical. In the end, they had to call an ambulance. I thought I would never see her again, but I was wrong. Having completed the last of my trials, I had to move on with my life. When all the lawsuits were settled, I was worth close to almost $3 million. This was even after I paid my brother 30% of everything that was awarded to me. He didn't agree, but I forced him to accept it. Now, I was divorced and wealthy, but what should I do next? I couldn't go back to my previous job. They were unhappy with me, to put it mildly, and I had no interest in working for them anyway. At that point, my life was just drifting, and I was still hurting. It was Susan who came up with the idea that would change my life, but for a long time, I didn't know whether this change was good or not. She suggested that I take a trip to Europe. She reminded me that I had always wanted to travel, and now I had the means to do so. Of course, when I talked about this, I always assumed that Carrie would accompany me. If I went on a trip now, Carrie probably wouldn't be with me. I started my journey in Italy. Everyone I talked to liked this country. I was impressed by the historical sites, and the wine was excellent, but overall I was disappointed. Then I went by train to Germany. On the train, I met a charming English woman named Sarah Smith. She turned out to be a good travel companion and a first-class guide. Sarah also turned heads with her beautiful blonde hair and soft brown eyes. She was short and had a stunning figure, but what I liked most was her bubbling enthusiasm for everything. It was a welcome change from the harsh existence I had suffered for the past 6 months. As it turned out, Sarah was a teacher at some school called Elgrove. She said the name as if I should know it, but it meant nothing to me. However, I asked all sorts of questions about the subjects Sarah taught and about her in general. I was a little surprised to learn that she taught math and science to children ages 8 to 13, and I could see from the sparkle in her eyes that she loved what she was doing. As far as I was concerned, Germany would have been a waste of time if it weren't for Sarah. Sarah had extensive knowledge of World War II. I've never really been interested in World War II, but Sarah brought the topic to life, and actually visiting the places where it happened was fascinating. Before anyone starts thinking about an affair between Sarah and me, the issue was immediately taken off the table when we first started talking. She told me that she had just broken up with her long-term boyfriend. It was a traumatic breakup, and Sarah had no intention of getting into another relationship for some time. On the other hand, I hastened to assure her that I was equally not interested in finding a new girl. I spoke in detail about my recent divorce, but I was surprised by Sarah's compassion for my ex-wife. Even though I was in no way looking for a new girlfriend, I was surprised by the number of women who flirted with me. I wondered if it was because I had acquired the appearance of a bad guy. I had 2 days of stubble on my face. I also grew my hair longer than ever before. I can assure you that this was not on purpose. I just became a little lazy about taking care of my hair since I didn't have to worry about work anymore. However, the flirting bothered me, and I constantly apologized to Sarah for it. I was embarrassed because some of the women were flirting right in front of her without knowing about our relationship. Sarah just laughed about it and even teased me when another woman started checking me out. In fairness, it should be noted that Sarah had an equal number of admirers, and she was equally embarrassed when they pursued her. I, of course, teased her back about this too. From Germany, I traveled independently to Sweden and Denmark. Sarah had booked an apartment in Paris for 2 weeks, so she headed there. I really enjoyed both Scandinavian countries that I visited. I found the people warm and friendly. The language barrier was a bit difficult without Sarah. She spoke 4 languages in addition to English, Italian, French, German, and Spanish. However, even without Sarah, I was able to make myself understood. By prior arrangement, I met Sarah at her apartment for the last 3 days of her vacation. Paris is a great city, but I wouldn't give you 2 cents for the people who live there. I know it's unfair to judge everyone by the few I've encountered, but it seemed to me that among the Parisians, there was some kind of deep-seated hostility toward Americans. And I find French men obnoxious. The attention that Sarah received in other countries paled in comparison with the aggression of the French. One even sat down at our table during dinner and spoke to Sarah in French. It didn't end well for the Frenchman when Sarah threw a glass of wine in his face. He just laughed and started making fun of me. However, when I stood up and he realized that I was towering over him, he finally got the hint and ran away. On my second night in Paris, I took Sarah out for dinner and a walk along the Seine. It was a beautiful night, and the moon was almost full. We stopped to watch several boats passing by. For the first time since my marriage ended, I felt at ease. "Sarah," I said, turning to her, "I want to thank you for everything you've done for me. You turned what could have been an unpleasant trip into something enjoyable. This was exactly what I needed." I leaned over and kissed her on the cheek. A second later, Sarah cupped my face with both hands and kissed me on the lips. I admit I kissed her back. When we pulled away from each other, neither of us said anything about the kiss. Instead, Sarah started talking about the history of the city and some of the landmarks we passed by. That night, I went to bed embarrassed but not unhappy. On our last night in Paris, Sarah cooked us a wonderful dinner in her apartment. We sat on her balcony, talking for hours. But then I reminded her that we had to get up early the next morning to catch our flight back to London. As I passed Sarah's room on my way to the bathroom, her door opened. She was wearing a beautiful white peignoir. In the light coming from her room, I could see the silhouette of her beautiful body. She threw herself into my arms and kissed me passionately. Of course, I responded. Before I knew it, we were on her bed, and I was massaging her breasts. Sarah groaned and pulled off her negligee. I began to move my hand over her stomach, kissing her neck, but suddenly, I stopped and pulled away from her. "I'm sorry, Sarah," I said in a choked voice. "I can't do this. It's still too early for me." I could see the disappointment in her eyes, but Sarah slowly stood up and hugged me. "I understand. I just think I might fall in love with you. You are a wonderful, wonderful woman," I assured her. "I'm just so confused, and the last thing I want to do is hurt you." She kissed me on the cheek, and I went to the bathroom to finish getting ready for bed. As I stood there brushing my teeth, I kept wondering if I had been a complete fool for turning Sarah down. Neither of us said anything about it the next day. When we landed in London, Sarah and I said goodbye, and we each took our own taxi. I thanked Sarah again for being such a wonderful guide, and then she kissed me on the cheek. Of course, we exchanged addresses before parting and promised to write, but I was sure that this would never happen. However, I invited her to have dinner with me on the last night of my vacation, and she agreed. I still had 2 weeks left on my schedule, so I rented a Range Rover and decided to drive around the UK. I planned to visit several major cities in England and then head to Scotland. I had been told the countryside was beautiful. I then planned to turn back south and visit Wales. I took the Range Rover because I was told that some of Scotland's roads can be quite steep. At least that was my plan, but it never happened. I cursed myself as I tried to get out of London the next evening. I was late at the bank because I was trying to make sure I had the funds when I got to Scotland. Not only that, but I had apparently packed my cell phone's power cord into one of my suitcases without realizing the battery was dead. Instead of stopping and looking for it in my luggage, I decided to use a paper map. This turned out to be a bad decision or a good one, depending on how you look at what happened. I left the bank just before closing. I studied the map for about 5 minutes before deciding which way to go. However, an hour passed, and I became hopelessly lost. I left London but had absolutely no idea where I was. I stopped and asked for directions, which made me even more lost. Frustrated, I pulled off the road I was driving on and stopped. I remembered the names of the last few roads I'd been on and thought I'd look them up on the map. But 20 minutes later, I discovered that none of these roads were indicated on my map. I got out of the car and opened the trunk, cursing. I started rummaging through my bags for my phone's power cord when it dawned on me that I had left it in my hotel room. I felt like a complete idiot. I was in a foreign country without a phone and had no idea where I was. While I was trying to figure out what to do next, I decided to pull out my gun. Yes, I know in England it is against the law to have guns. In fact, I think it is illegal to own guns in most European countries. But I'm an American, and I wasn't going to travel without protection. I took my Ruger 9mm with 2 magazines, each holding 18 rounds. I decided that this would be enough protection. You're probably wondering how I was able to get my gun through customs. Actually, it wasn't that difficult. First, I disassembled the gun and then put the parts in special boxes that I made myself. If they had x-rayed my suitcase and looked inside those boxes, the strategically placed metal would have made the pieces look completely different, for example, like a smoking pipe. In any case, during my entire trip, I did not have the slightest problem. You're probably wondering if the gun was taken apart, how could it be of any use? Usually, when I was traveling in the countryside, I kept all the parts on hand. I could quickly assemble the gun if I needed it. So far, I haven't needed it, and I hoped I never would. But right now, I was in the middle of nowhere, and it was already getting dark. I assembled the pistol and loaded it. Then I put the gun in my belt and drove slowly along the country road, wondering where it led. I meandered until I saw a large, stately mansion up on the hill ahead. Surely someone here could tell me where the hell I was. The road the hill and brought me to the back of the mansion. My heart sank a little as I didn't see any lights on this side of the building. I turned off the car and headed to the front door. I was just about to turn the corner when I heard screams and 2 shots. As I quickly looked around the building, I saw 2 men lying face down on the ground. Another man was holding a small boy with a hood over his head who was kicking furiously. 2 other men were shouting at each other, with one of them pointing at the 2 men lying on the ground. "You screwed up big time, buddy," I heard the man pointing his finger shout. "Go back inside and make sure everyone else is neutralized." As soon as the man disappeared inside and the man struggling with the boy tried to push him into the car, I got out and shouted, "Drop the gun and raise your hands." The man did not drop the gun. Instead, he turned around with lightning speed and shot at me. I returned fire. His shot missed, but mine hit him in the shoulder. Not only did he drop the gun, but he also fell to his knees. The man holding the boy released him to see what happened. At that moment, the boy started running. The man rushed after him. I held my breath, took aim, and shot at the man. The bullet hit him in the leg. He fell, but only for a moment. The man quickly stood up and hobbled in a different direction. Taking advantage of this temporary respite, I rushed back to my car and started it. I pressed the gas pedal and roared out from behind the building. As I rushed past the man on his knees, he grabbed his gun. A second later, he was already shooting. I figured he was shooting left-handed, so I was relatively safe. I was wrong. I felt a burn on my lower left side, and when I reached out to touch it, there was blood on my hand. I had no idea how badly I was hurt, but now I couldn't stop. I rushed along the road and saw that the boy was running parallel to it. In a panic, I braked and opened the back door. "Get in, kid!" I shouted. "They will be chasing us in a few seconds." Fear was written on the boy's face, but I think he decided that he would be safer with me than without me. As soon as he slammed the door, I pressed the pedal again, and we rushed, as I assumed, towards the highway. "Hey, kid," I asked, looking at him in the rearview mirror, "do you have any idea where we are?" The boy looked shocked and simply shook his head. When I got to the end of the driveway, it was a 50-50 decision, right or left. I chose left. Bad decision. If I had gone right, the road would have led to the highway, and there I could quickly find help. Turning left, I went deeper into the countryside, where there seemed to be no houses. I later learned that this was an area with very large estates. Some houses were literally miles apart. "Damn," I said out loud. "We're almost out of gas." The boy seemed a little confused, so I thought he didn't understand me. "Gasoline," I said slowly. "We're almost out of gas." "Oh, I understand," the boy commented weakly. "It's horrible. What are we going to do?" I liked his British English. He was charming with children. However, in this particular case, it was the last thing on my mind. "I'm going to get off this road," I said, turning sharply left and heading up the hill. Thank God I had a Range Rover. It made off-road driving easy. I didn't think the Mercedes I saw in the driveway could handle it. After checking the compass built into the dashboard, I said to the boy, "I'm going to head south because at least London is south of us." I looked at the boy again in the rearview mirror, and it was clear that he was scared but still in control. I gave him credit for that. Most kids in his place would be hysterical. As we raced forward, I asked what his name was. The question seemed to frighten him, but he stammered, J. George. "George, my name is Mike," I told him. "Now tell me what's going on." "Please, sir, what is your full name?" "My full name?" The question puzzled me until it suddenly dawned on me what he was asking. "Oh, my full name is Mike Adams." "Thank you for saving me, Mr. Adams," the boy said in a timid voice. "I haven't saved anyone yet," I answered and continued to ask, "Where are we, and why did these people try to grab you?" I don't know exactly," George answered. His voice was shaking, and I didn't want to push him too hard. I love that he showed so much self-control and courage. I was at my friend Peter's house over the weekend when these people broke into the house. They threw a bag over my head, and one of them dragged me away. I don't know what happened to Peter, his parents, or their servants. Looks like Peter's parents have money, and this is a kidnapping. They probably took Peter too. I expressed my view of the situation. We must keep moving until we find some help. We continued through fields and streams but found no houses or any buildings for that matter. All I could think of was to keep heading south. Eventually, we had to come across a road. We went over one hill, went down into a field, and then went up another hill. As we climbed the second hill, the car began to jerk. I realized that I was almost out of gas, so I found some bushes to hide the car. When the car stopped, I got out and walked around behind it. Lifting the trunk lid, I pulled one of my suitcases towards me and began to examine it. I didn't find what I wanted, so I pulled another suitcase towards me. After about 30 seconds of searching, I pulled out my flashlight. "George, listen," I told the boy, opening the door for him. "We have to walk. I don't know if these people will realize that we are no longer in the car, but we have to assume they will and keep moving until we find help." Before we set off, I grabbed 2 sweaters, a wool hat, a large bottle of water, and 4 packages of crackers. It was getting chilly outside, and I didn't know how long we'd be on the run until we found help. Besides, I didn't know about the boy, but I was hungry. I thought the best direction would be south, so I looked up at the sky and noticed a star that was the brightest. I decided that we could follow it. We walked for about 3 hours, stopping from time to time to rest and drink water. We crossed several streams, but I did not dare fill my bottle with stream water. The time was approaching midnight, and I knew the boy was very tired. Despite the difficult journey, he did not utter a word of complaint. We barely spoke because I didn't want to give away our location in case anyone was nearby. Finding a thicket of bushes, I collected 2 piles of leaves to build a makeshift bed, then told George to get some sleep. He did not argue and, after a few minutes, fell fast asleep. I stayed awake for another hour. The first thing I did was examine my wound on my left side where the bullet hit me. There was a deep wound, and it was bleeding, so I tore my shirt and bandaged the wound as best I could. I then took one of the sweaters and threw it over George. I put the other one on and then fell into a very restless sleep. The first rays of the morning sun woke me up. As I sat up, I groaned. My side hurt like hell. Now I regretted not bringing ibuprofen with me. When I sat up, it woke George. When he got up, I asked, "How do you feel?" "Everything hurts, sir," he replied. "It's the same for me," I laughed. "Here, take some crackers." I threw him the package. While he sat and ate, I studied the boy. He was still scared but surprisingly calm. I passed him the water and gave him another bag of crackers. I then checked my wound, and luckily, it didn't seem to be bleeding anymore. "Excuse me, sir," George asked timidly. "What will happen to us?" "We're going to find help, and then your parents will pick you up. I'll continue my vacation, but first, I guess I'll have to see a doctor to get stitches." "You seem awfully brave, sir," he said. "I wish I was as brave." "What are you talking about?" "You were extremely brave," I assured him. "Most kids would have their eyes wide open in fear." "But I really cried, sir," he looked at me with concern. "You won't tell anyone about this, will you?" "Listen, George," I said softly. "There's nothing wrong with crying. Everyone cries at one time or another. Crying simply shows that you care about something. There's no shame in this." "I just don't want people to be disappointed in me," George said, looking straight at me. "George, I'm going to teach you one of life's most important lessons," I said with a smile. "There's only one person you never want to disappoint." George looked at me in confusion. "Who could it be?" "The only person you never want to disappoint is yourself," I said firmly. "If you do what you think is right and do the best you can, then you don't need to apologize to anyone. And if anyone tells you otherwise, tell them to go to hell." This made George laugh, and his mood began to lift. Once we had collected our meager belongings, we were on our way again. I was in a lot of pain, and I knew my wound was infected. I just couldn't keep it clean. Not only that, but I no longer had a guiding star, and I wanted to stay behind the trees rather than openly walk through the fields. The going was more difficult than last night, but we managed to trudge on. In the distance, I saw helicopters circling. I hoped they were looking for us and wanted them to head in our direction. By midday, we were out of water, and I had no choice but to fill our bottle from a stream. I just hoped there weren't any harmful bacteria floating in the water. However, I reasoned that they had to find us before either of us got sick. Night began to fall on us, and we still had not found a single house. I later learned that somehow we managed to get between at least a dozen houses. If we had only veered a few hundred yards one way or the other, we would have seen them. Once I found some thick bushes and prepared our beds, we made ourselves comfortable. Only this time, there were not so many leaves, and it was quite painful for me. I also felt like I was on fire and must have been starting to have a fever. The next day, we started again. Only now, it was difficult for me to keep up. There was sympathy, uncertainty, and fear in George's eyes. I knew George still didn't trust me completely, but I just smiled at him and told him it was okay. He didn't believe me for a second. Throughout the second day and now the third, our conversations became much livelier. I no longer worried about being heard. We talked about many things, his studies, friends, and even a little about his parents. He seemed reluctant to talk about them, so I didn't press him. He said that his father and mother were very strict and expected a lot from him. I reminded him again that the only person he had to satisfy was himself. Towards evening, I began to really burn with fever. We reached a place where we couldn't stay in the wooded area. We needed to cross the field to move on. I told George we were going to walk quickly across the field to the woods on the other side. We were about 100 yards from the edge of the forest when I heard the distinctive sound of a diesel engine. I cursed under my breath because it sounded like a Mercedes. "Run, George!" I ordered and rushed after him. I looked back just in time to see the Mercedes come around the hill and start to descend into the field straight towards us. We had just reached a group of fallen trees when the shooting started. They were coming from the car that was rushing towards us. We climbed over the fallen trees, and I took position. "George, listen to me carefully," I said, holding his right hand. "I want you to keep running. Try to get away from here as far as possible. But when you hear the shooting stop, find a place to hide and don't come out until they leave." "But Mr. Adams, what about you?" he asked, panic in his eyes. "I will delay them as long as I can," I said. "Now be brave and go like I told you." I think George was going to argue with me, but I pushed him away, and he started running. This was good since the Mercedes was now less than 30 meters away from me. They started shooting again, but this time, I started shooting back. I don't think they expected this. People in Britain don't usually own guns. In any case, the car skidded and stopped on its side. The men hid behind the car and started shooting. As far as I could tell, there were 5 men in the car, and all of them were armed. I found a place where I could kneel and see the space between the trees to shoot. As I cautiously returned fire, I hoped to hell that George had put some distance between us. I was halfway through my second magazine when this happened. It seemed that the firefight lasted for several hours, but in fact, less than 5 minutes passed. So far, I'd been lucky. The trees blocked most of the shots. But then one bullet came through the branches and hit me in the right side of my chest. This knocked me back to the ground. It took me maybe 10 seconds or more to come to my senses. While I was lying there, one of the men decided to check on me. This was a serious mistake on his part. I shot, and he fell. I shot twice more but then started to lose consciousness. At that moment, I heard a roar and saw a shadow flash over us. That's when I saw the helicopters flying in. Armed men descended on ropes, shooting as they came down. Then my mind went blank, and I closed my eyes. I woke up to a bright light and incredible pain. There was a woman immediately next to me, and I remember someone saying, "We need to get him back to the operating room." Then darkness fell over me again. When I woke up the second time, it seemed to me that I was floating on something. The room I was in was light, and I had no pain. There was a nurse next to me who felt my pulse. When she saw that my eyes were open, she smiled. "Welcome, Mr. Adams," she said in a delightful British accent. "It's so nice to see you among the living. You made us scared for a while last night. We thought several times that we were going to lose you, but the doctor said that you are finally out of danger." My throat was as raw as it could be, but I had to ask, "The boy?" That's all I could squeeze out. "Everything is fine, Mr. Adams," the nurse said kindly. "Soon someone will come to talk to you." The nurse didn't really answer my question, and it filled me with anxiety. Soon I fell asleep. When I woke up again, I saw that it was already night. After a while, an orderly appeared, fed me soup, and helped me drink some juice. There were IVs placed around my bed, and they were all connected to me. I don't know how long I slept next, but when I woke up again, it was already light. The doctor stood next to the bed studying my chart. I blurted out my question again, "The boy?" "Oh, Mr. Adams, you're awake." "Great." The doctor smiled at me. "The boy is fine. However, I was told that he was completely distraught when you were brought in. He was found holding you and begging you to wake up. He was covered in your blood but otherwise unharmed. Is he your relative?" I shook my head, but even this slight effort tired me, and I fell asleep again. But I must not have slept that long because when I woke up, it was still light. A few minutes later, the nurse came in and smiled when she saw that I was awake. "How are you feeling, Mr. Adams?" she asked. "My throat really hurts," I answered just above a whisper. In addition, my chest and side hurt. "I'll bring you something for the pain," she said, and then added, "There are people who want to talk to you. Do you feel strong enough to do this?" I nodded. A gentleman who appeared to be in his 40s came into my room. He sat down on the chair next to my bed. His hair was gray, and he had a thick mustache. "Mr. Adams, I'm Inspector Blair from Scotland Yard. I would like to get an informal statement from you, if possible." "Of course," I said, and was surprised that my voice seemed firmer. "Obviously, you had a difficult ordeal," the inspector began. "The doctors told me that you had difficulty breathing for some time. They are still a little concerned about your infection, but fortunately, you seem to be on the road to recovery. I was wondering if you could tell me about your involvement in the incident last Monday." I shook my head slowly, trying to collect my thoughts. "I'm afraid I can't tell you very much. I really have no idea what was going on. I think I'm facing a kidnapping." Before I knew it, George and I were on the run. We spent several days trying to find help, but never found anyone. Then the kidnappers caught up with us. I tried to hold them off long enough for George to get away. The inspector smiled at me as if he knew much more about the incident than I did. "Well, it was not difficult at all because I knew practically nothing. Tell me, Mr. Adams, how did it happen that you ended up in the very house where the kidnapping took place?" "I'm lost," I admitted, embarrassedly. I didn't charge my phone before leaving London and tried to use a paper map, but all I managed to do was get hopelessly lost. I found a dirt road that led to the back of some mansion. I was hoping I could get directions from someone there. However, when I came around the corner, I saw that they were trying to kidnap George. I had a pistol with me and used it to free the boy. We left in my rental car, but I was almost out of gas. When the car stopped, George and I had to walk. We couldn't find anyone to help us after that. I just tried to hold them off." "How did you find us?" "Since the abduction was reported, search teams and helicopters have been combing the area. One of the helicopter pilots noticed the car speeding down the slope and followed it. They came across your firefight and stopped it. Then you and the boy were taken to the hospital. At first, we thought the boy was seriously injured because there was a lot of blood on him, but as it turned out, it was your blood. He refused to leave you." "I told him he was brave," I said. The inspector leaned back in his chair and smiled. "This is an amazing story." "It's true, I swear." I protested. "If you don't believe me, ask George." "Oh, I believe you, Mr. Adams. However, there is one point that I would like to make clear. The pistol you used to defend yourself, where did you get it?" I felt like a deer in headlights. The phrase "oh, flash" smashed through my head. I knew I was in trouble now. However, I knew that without this gun, I would probably be dead. I brought it with me from the United States, I answered quietly. I don't think so, Mr. Adams, said the inspector with a chuckle. It is an offense to bring weapons into the UK. The pistol we found had its serial numbers filed off, so you must have received the weapon from the kidnappers. You're very lucky to have done this, aren't you? Confusion on my part suddenly gave way to crystal clarity. The inspector was giving me a chance to plausibly deny the presence of the gun. I wasn't one to look a gift horse in the mouth. I quickly confirmed the inspector's assumption. Yes, that's exactly what happened. I surprised one of the kidnappers and was able to take the gun from him. Excellent, said Inspector Blair, standing up. You know, I wouldn't mind a cup of tea. May I suggest you have one too? To tell you the truth, Inspector, I would kill for a cup of coffee. He laughed and said, I'll see what I can do. 10 minutes later, the inspector returned with an orderly who had a cup of tea and a mug of coffee. There was also a plate of what I think the English call biscuits. Mr. Adams, the inspector began after taking a sip of tea, I have a lot to tell you, and we have a lot to work out before you talk to anyone else. So, let me start by correcting your misconception. The boy you know as George is actually Peter. Peter is the future Duke of Windsor, and you would probably call him the future King of England. However, the correct title is future King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This information shocked me to the core. I couldn't think of anything to say, so I remained silent. His Highness was spending the weekend with his friend George at Lord and Lady Ashford's estate. Lord and Lady Ashford are George's parents. There was a guard of 8 people there. 2 of this guard were killed, 3 seriously wounded, and the rest incapacitated. This was a well-planned, well-coordinated attempt to kidnap the prince. In fact, if you hadn't stumbled upon it, they would have managed to capture him, and we would have been completely unaware of what happened. Why these people tried to kidnap the prince, we still have no idea. I also have no idea how they knew where the prince was. These are the things that we will definitely look into. As for now, all I know for sure is that you are a real hero. I considered the inspector's information and then weakly replied, I don't feel like a hero. Actually, I'm just a little nauseous. Should I call someone? Asked the inspector. I shook my head. No, I'll be fine. Now we have to decide what to do next. The inspector took the last sip of tea and took out a notepad and pen. Information about the assassination attempt on the prince leaked out almost immediately. Since then, there has been a commotion in the country. Now that the prince has been safely rescued, celebrations have continued for several days here and abroad. However, it also put intense pressure on virtually every investigative agency in the UK to get to the bottom of what happened. I suddenly felt panicked as the whole incident looked like a terrorist attack. If this was the case, then my family as well as myself could be in danger. May I make a request? I asked. You, of course, can make a request, but whether I can satisfy it is a completely different question. Could you not mention my name? I asked immediately. Interesting, said the inspector, smoothing his mustache. Why do you want me to do this? I just think it would be safer, I tried to explain. If this is the work of some terrorists and I am on the list of those who thwarted their plans, they may try to strike back at my family and me. Yes, I understand what the problem might be, the inspector agreed. I'll talk to my boss about it and let you know in a few days. For now, we are keeping you a secret. Are there people who might become anxious if they don't hear from you? If so, we will contact them and tell them the cover story. Maybe my parents, I said after thinking a little. What day is today? Today is Friday, the 6th. I lost almost a week, I said quietly. I have a flight scheduled back to the United States in a week, starting this Sunday. I doubt I'll be out of the hospital in a week. It might be better if you send an email to my parents using my account and simply say that I am extending my vacation. We found your itinerary and your luggage. We've been tracking the places you plan to stay to see if anyone has contacted you. So far, no one has tried to do this. Oh, another person you should know about, I said, remembering my obligation. I was to have dinner with Miss Sarah Smith on Saturday evening. The inspector's eyebrows rose when I mentioned my invitation to dinner. How do you know Miss Smith? I met her on the train on the way to Germany, I explained. We became friends, and she also became my unofficial guide. There's nothing romantic between us. She was just very kind and helpful. I understand, said the inspector, standing up. Shall we write her an email? When I nodded, the inspector continued, I think it would be better if we send her an email and let her know that you were in an accident. You do not have serious injuries, but you would prefer to be treated at home by your doctor. In the meantime, police officers will remain outside your room 24 hours a day until we decide how to proceed. I'll contact you in a few days when we have a better handle on things. In the meantime, I hope you understand that we will keep you incommunicado. Will this be a problem? I shook my head. The next few days were very difficult. As I began to recover, they reduced the dose of painkillers. This meant that there were times when I was in pain, especially immediately after physical therapy. I didn't feel good. At first, it was interesting to watch television reports. The mood, especially in Britain, was one of grateful jubilation, but there was also anger at the police for failing to prevent the abduction. After watching a day or two of continuous coverage, it became difficult to watch. I believe I was suffering from a mild form of PTSD. Just when I was beginning to believe that Inspector Blair had forgotten about me, he arrived the following Tuesday. I was hoping he would give me some good news, like when I would be allowed to be discharged. I just wanted to get better and go home. I was standing at the window, wishing I could be outside, when Inspector Blair entered my room. You look surprisingly well, Mr. Adams. I'm so glad you're recovering so quickly. This makes my news even sweeter. Sounds promising, I said, sitting down on the edge of my bed. We have made incredible efforts to get to the bottom of this cowardly attack. Unfortunately, we still don't know who was behind the kidnapping. However, we managed to capture 2 of the criminals alive, and we still hope to get at least one of them to tell us what we want to know. Well, that makes my request just as important as before, I replied. I hope you will keep my name secret. You are an interesting guy, Mr. Adams. Most men would like to bask in the glory of a hero, but you want to remain anonymous. Your first concern is for your family, which is very commendable. But to reassure you, my superiors agree that you should remain anonymous. We will make every effort to ensure that your name does not become public knowledge. However, I must admit that my superiors were in favor of making your name public immediately. Some in the department suspected that you may have been part of a conspiracy. At first, they didn't believe your story that you accidentally witnessed a kidnapping. Some believed that you were part of a conspiracy, but at the last moment, they chickened out. However, checking the tracking device on your rental car confirmed everything you told us. In addition, the prince was very insistent that you had nothing to do with the kidnapping. This is wonderful, I said with a smile. I assume this means that I will be able to return to the United States as soon as I am discharged from the hospital. I can't wait to get home. Yes, you will be allowed to leave the country as soon as you are discharged, the inspector confirmed. We believe that the sooner you leave the country, the safer you will be. Have you received any messages from my parents? I asked. Yes, they tried to call you and send an email, the inspector confirmed. Obviously, we couldn't call back, but we did let them know via email that you had limited cell coverage. I have spoken to the doctors, and they will discharge you on Saturday. We have taken the liberty of booking you on a flight leaving this afternoon. On that day, you will leave the hospital in the afternoon accompanied by a security officer. On Friday, before I was due to leave the hospital, the inspector showed up again and returned my cell phone. He told me that I was free to call whoever I wanted. I called my parents and told them that I had an accident. I lied and told them it wasn't serious but required a hospital visit. My mother was very upset and wanted to fly in to help me get back. I lied again and told her I had a bad fall from my bike but that I was fine. I told her that I would be home before she even had time to buy a ticket. This seemed to calm her down. On Saturday morning, after breakfast, I got up and got dressed. I couldn't wait to get out of the hospital and go home. Around 11, I heard a noise in the corridor near my room. Looking out, I saw a well-dressed couple and a boy walking towards my room. It took a moment, but then I recognized George, or I corrected myself, Peter. As the couple approached, the men and women on both sides of the corridor either bowed or curtsied. It was unreal to watch this. You read stories about how members of the British royal family are treated, but you never expect to see it in person. The couple was very kind to everyone they passed, but Peter seemed worried. When he finally saw me, he quickened his pace and got to me before his parents. "Your Highness," I nodded with a smile. "Mr. Adams, it's so nice to see you in good health," he said with a wide smile. "When they lifted you into the helicopter, I was so scared that they had killed you. Thank you very much for helping me." By then, the king and queen were already close to their son. "Your Majesties," I said with a slight bow, "this is truly a great honor for me." "No, Mr. Adams, it is an honor for us," said the king, extending his hand. We shook hands. I couldn't believe I was shaking hands with the king, and I could never tell anyone about it. "Well," I said to myself, "it will be better this way." "Mr. Adams," the queen continued, "I will never be able to fully thank you for saving our son. I had a very difficult time after this incident. I shudder to think what would have happened if you hadn't been there. You will always be in our thoughts and prayers." Then the queen held out her hand, looked quickly around as I shook it, then raised my hand and kissed it. I was completely surprised by this action and had no idea how to react. "You can be very proud of your son," was all I could say. He was very brave in very difficult circumstances. Without his help, I don't think we would have made it. At this point, the meeting ended and they left. The royal family was warned not to make too much of a fuss about me, as this could raise questions in people's minds. A little later, I learned that this visit was supposedly outside their royal schedule. However, they insisted on visiting the hospital to thank me personally. I was touched by this gesture. All the time I spent in the hospital gave me a lot of time to think about my life, and I wasn't particularly happy with myself. The flight home still had me thinking about what to do next. My parents were there to greet me, and I could see the relief in my mother's eyes as her concerns about my health were put to rest. However, she hugged me tightly. My father was also happy to see me at home and hugged me too. I winced slightly at this and explained that the wounds were still a little sore. However, I was delighted by the hug. This was something he rarely did. My dad always told people that he wasn't a hugger. Now, this is not entirely true. He takes every opportunity to hug my mother. As we stood at the baggage carousel, my mother became very quiet and serious. "Mike, I did something that might make you really angry with me, but please, if you're going to be angry with me." "I can't think of anything you would do, Mom, that could make me angry." "You may change your mind very soon," my mother said and looked at one of the exit doors. I looked where my mother was looking and saw Carrie standing there, looking upset. Her red eyes told me she was crying. Carrie looked pale and was shaking slightly. A few weeks ago, I would have gotten angry at my mother and run away, but when you've been as close to death as I was, you have a completely different outlook on life. Suddenly, many of the things you thought were so important are no longer so. When I looked at Carrie, I no longer saw the cheating wife. I saw a woman who was lonely, sad, and scared. I also saw a woman who was taken advantage of and a woman who seemed to still love me. She was still the beautiful woman I fell in love with. I smiled at her and walked over to where she was standing. "Hi, Carrie," I said softly. "Thank you for coming to welcome me home." At these words, Carrie's restraint collapsed, and she rushed into my arms. She sobbed into my shoulder, repeating over and over again, "I am so sorry, please forgive me." I calmed her down and then took her to where my parents were standing. They had already taken my luggage. "I didn't like the food on the plane, so I ate almost nothing," I said cheerfully. "What would you say if I invited you all to dinner?" "I'm starving." I can't say things suddenly got better between me and Carrie, but it was a start. At the beginning, I still had no idea what I wanted. All I knew was that I didn't want to punish Carrie anymore. I wanted her to be happy. A few days later, I invited her to lunch to discuss our problems. We then started seeing a psychologist and finally started dating again. What I learned from our sessions was that Carrie was afraid of disappointing me, that's why she agreed to the affair. I also learned that I reinforced this belief by lavishly praising my wife when she did something I thought was good, and when she didn't live up to my expectations, Carrie saw my disappointment. I never realized I was doing this, but looking back, I could see that it was absolutely true. It took 6 months to work through our issues, but I never stopped loving Carrie. So, with a small number of relatives, Carrie and I got married for the second time in the backyard of her parents' house. Of the people involved in our remarriage, other than ourselves, I believe our mothers were the happiest people there. I took Carrie on a cruise for our honeymoon. Oddly enough, Carrie and I didn't have before we got married. Neither of us wanted to cloud our emotions, so that first night in our cabin, we were both nervous. I know this sounds funny because we made love hundreds of times while we were first married, but this second marriage was so different from our first. I know that I, for example, felt a connection with Carrie on a much deeper level. To me, Carrie has always been the most beautiful girl I have ever known. She had long brown hair and regular facial features. Her breasts were quite voluptuous, but it was her soft brown eyes that drew me to her when we first met and still captivate me to this day. As I climbed into bed with Carrie, I felt her tremble with anticipation. She smelled so wonderful and felt even better. We sat for a while I kissed and gently blew on her neck. When she turned to me, we kissed lustfully, massaging each other with our tongues. After I lifted her nightgown and took off my t-shirt, I started kissing one of Carrie's breasts. We spent the rest of the night making love. The rest of the honeymoon was much like that first night. Of course, we went on excursions, danced, attended shows, but mostly we made love. I was in love with my wife again, but there was still a pang of mistrust in the back of my mind. It only reared its ugly head years later. I think it happened that first night, but 2 months later, Carrie found out she was pregnant. 7 months later, we had a boy whom we named Grant. 11 months later, we had a girl whom we named Louise. 3 years after that, Carrie returned to work part-time. At first, I was happy with Carrie's new job, but I couldn't help it. Every month, my suspicions and jealousy grew. I kept my fears to myself, but it created tension in our marriage. Even though Carrie didn't do anything to make me worry, I was worried nonetheless. At the same time, I didn't realize it, but I began to distance myself from my wife. I guess I was mentally preparing myself because I couldn't shake the feeling that Carrie would betray me again. Carrie suffered because of my mood, and it affected her. We started arguing more and more often. Eventually, I began to think about divorce. It was Carrie who persuaded me to see a psychologist again. At first, the sessions seemed to achieve nothing at all, but then gradually, I was able to see the hole that I had dug for myself. The relationship between us became much better after I realized my problem. Then we began to rebuild our relationship. For the next year, life was great for my family and me. Then disaster struck us. Unbeknownst to us, Justin Bosner was released early from prison. His hatred for me grew exponentially during his time in prison. Carrie and I had just put the kids to bed when we heard several windows in the front of our house break. I went to check what was wrong, while Carrie went to make sure the kids were okay. When I walked into the living room, I ran into Justin, and he pointed a gun at me. "Well, Mikey baby, I've been waiting for this moment for a long time," he growled. "I'm going to beat the crap out of you and then your pretty little wife. I'm sure she'll love it just as much as before." I wanted to rip this head off, and I took a step forward, but he pointed the gun even further. "I wouldn't do that, Mike. I can finish you off before you even get close to me, but I want this moment to last a little longer." At that moment, I saw Carrie fly into the living room from the dining room and grab the gun. When Justin tried to retrieve it, I instantly moved and tried to grab the gun, but it fired before I could do it. Carrie fell to the floor, and I punched Justin in the jaw, causing him to stumble back, where he hit his head on the wall and fell unconscious. Then I found myself on my knees, cradling Carrie. She was wounded in the stomach. I grabbed the phone off the coffee table and dialed 911. It seemed like hours, but 8 minutes later, the police and ambulance were there. I took a towel to press against the wound. I remember shouting, "Please hold on, Carrie, please do not die." Carrie lay in my arms, looking up at me. "You are the only one I have ever loved. Thanks for taking me back. Take care of our children." Then her eyes closed. They never opened again. The hospital staff did everything they could to save her, but the damage was too great. I was in complete despair. Thank God for our two mothers. They moved in with me and took care of everything while I was out. It took losing Carrie to finally realize that I was her one true love. I know I was at the funeral, but I can't remember anything about it. All I remember is thinking that I should be dead and not Carrie. Justin was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He committed suicide in prison before his trial. I was angry that he got off so easily. It took about 3 months, but I finally started to come out of my stupor. My children were the main reason for my recovery, as I had to be strong for them. They missed their mother as much as I did, but like children, they recovered quickly. I didn't know if I would ever be cured, but they considered me their support for Carrie's sake. I couldn't let them down. I was still traumatized, and no matter how hard I tried to hide it, my mother knew. It was she who suggested that I go travel with the children. I was reluctant at first, but eventually agreed that we would go to the UK. My parents and Carrie's parents agreed to come with me to help me with the children. By this time, I was no longer worried about returning to England. About a year and a half after the incident, Scotland Yard uncovered a plot to kidnap the Crown Prince. It turned out that the plot was hatched by a small group of opponents of the royal family. There were only 30-odd people in the group, 2 of whom worked at Buckingham Palace and had access to the royal schedule. Most of the participants had no idea what their leaders were doing, but they all received prison sentences of varying lengths. As it turned out, the ultimate plan was to kill the Crown Prince. I wisely used the funds received during the divorce. Now they have grown to almost $5 million, so I decided to be extravagant on this trip and booked first-class tickets for everyone. I booked a room at the Langham, one of the best hotels in London. I then made sure to book a passenger minibus because I wanted to complete my tour of Scotland and Wales. I didn't realize it, but a media storm was about to break out in London, and I was about to find myself in the middle of it all. When I spoke to Inspector Blair and asked that my name not appear in any of the reports, I assumed that the records would be sealed forever. However, they did not permanently seal the records. They just sealed them for 5 years. If the case remains unsolved, the sealing period will be extended. Another year passed before anyone asked to open the records to the public. This request was finally granted. At one time, I asked that my name not be mentioned in any reports, but this did not happen. My name was everywhere. When we returned to the UK, the more persistent reporters who followed my movements calculated the date of my arrival. If I had even the slightest inkling of what was about to happen, I would never have taken this trip. I would move my entire family to a place known only to me and stay there until everything calmed down. But I had no idea, so I went on a trip that I hoped would help me heal my soul from the loss of Carrie and the guilt I felt for not fully trusting her love. As I pulled out my bags and began packing for this trip, I discovered Sarah SMI's long-forgotten phone number. I was sure that the number was no longer in service or was now being used by someone else. However, with the slight chance that it might be hers, I called. If I could contact her, perhaps I could convince her to join us on our tour. At any rate, I felt that I still owed her dinner for the one I had cancelled when I fled England over 6 years ago. I was pleasantly surprised to find that the number was indeed still Sarah's. I was even more glad that she immediately remembered who I was. Sarah told me she was very disappointed that I had to cancel our dinner. However, Sarah also assured me that she completely understood why I had to do this. I felt a little guilty that I couldn't tell her the real reason, but this was a chapter of my life I felt it was best to leave in the past. We talked for a good 2 hours. I can only imagine what my phone bill will be like. However, it was a very pleasant conversation. I have several friends who are so close that we can go months without talking, but when we do, it feels like no time has passed at all. So it was with Sarah. Little by little, we told each other about our lives over the past 5 years. Sarah was pleased when I told her that I had remarried Carrie and had 2 children. Sarah told me that she still teaches at the same school but is now an assistant principal. She wasn't married for long. About 2 years ago, the marriage was disastrous, and the divorce was particularly nasty, leaving her ex-husband extremely bitter. It was clear that Sarah's failed marriage was still bothering her. So I finally told her about Carrie's murder and my attempts to put my life back together. There was a long silence after I finished talking about Carrie's death, and for a moment, I thought Sarah might have hung up. But then I heard her sobbing on the other end of the line. "Oh, Michael, you make me feel so miserable," she said in a trembling voice. She always addressed me by my full name and rarely by my short name. "However, you have your children. I know this seems like small consolation right now, but in the years to come, you will realize how truly blessed you are." At first, I didn't know what to say, but then I chuckled hesitantly and said that we should leave the sad stories behind. Sarah agreed and started telling me about some of the funny things her students did. I was grateful for the humor, but eventually revealed the real purpose of my call. "Look, I know I'm saying this at the last minute, but I'm coming to England with the children and their grandparents," I explained. "I'd like to be able to travel a little. If there is any way you could free yourself, I would like you to join us." "Oh, I'd love to do that, Michael, but I can't get free right now. It's the middle of the semester, and I have so many classes to teach." "I'm so terribly sorry," Sarah replied. "I understand," I said, but couldn't hide my disappointment. "Look, I still owe you dinner from last time. Perhaps you could set aside an evening to have dinner with me?" "I would love to do that," Sarah said immediately. "However, you must promise to bring your children and their grandparents." "I would love to meet all of them." "Wonderful," I said joyfully. "I'll call you when I get to London, and we'll work something out." As I said, even as we flew across the Atlantic, secrets that I had hoped would be locked away forever were about to come out. We arrived early in the morning, and I knew the best way to beat jet lag was to stay up until it was time to go to bed in the new place. If you did this, then the next day, you were synced to the new time zone. Since the children slept for most of the flight, they were eager to start enjoying the trip. My parents and Carrie's parents weren't happy with the plan, but they went along with it because I insisted. As soon as we checked into our rooms, I called Sarah and made plans to have dinner with her the following evening. We then set off to explore London. We visited the Tower of London, took a boat trip on the Thames, and visited Legoland Windsor. We all had a great time. But the next morning, everything was about to change. That night, I went to bed happier than I had been in a long time. I was looking forward to our tour, and I was looking forward to dinner with Sarah. The next morning, I woke up to a knock on my room door. I booked a 2-room suite for myself and the children. The kids were still sleeping in one of the bedrooms when I hurriedly pulled on my trousers and shirt. I stumbled toward the door and opened it. A respectable middle-aged man stood on the threshold with a newspaper under his arm. "Sorry for the intrusion, Mr. Adams," the man said apologetically. "My name is James Batterman, and I am the manager of this hotel. I sincerely apologize for disturbing your sleep, but I urgently need to talk to you." Still half asleep, I motioned for the man to enter. Behind him, the waiter wheeled a cart filled with juice, tea, coffee, and covered plates. Mr. Batterman motioned for the waiter to place everything on a table in the corner. Once this was over, the waiter was released. Mr. Batterman immediately poured me a cup of coffee, which I gratefully accepted. "I think you should sit down, Mr. Adams," he said. "There is news that I'm pretty sure you're completely unaware of." As soon as I sat down, Mr. Batterman unfolded the newspaper in front of me. The headline read, "Prince Peter Kidnapping Mystery Solved." Under the title was a large color photograph of me. I quickly scanned the article and groaned. My thoughts were racing in a million directions at once, but the main thing in my thoughts was the protection of my children. After reading enough of the article to know that I had been completely exposed, I looked up at Mr. Batterman. "How bad is it?" I asked. "Right now, hundreds of people and dozens of media representatives are crowding around the hotel, hoping to catch a glimpse of you. Apparently, rumors have leaked out that you are in London and that you are staying here. The TV stations have been talking about you all morning. I expect the crowd outside the hotel to increase. I have already contacted the police to request some form of crowd control. Simply put, Mr. Adams, you have become a media sensation. All of Britain wants to know everything about you." My head was a mess, and I still had no idea what to do. But then I suddenly felt that I knew why Mr. Batterman was visiting me. "I assume you would like us to stay somewhere else?" I asked. "Oh, heavens no," said Mr. Batterman with a look of horror on his face. "I'm only here to let you know what's going on and to assure you that we will do everything in our power to protect your privacy." What do you propose to do? I still wasn't sure what to do with this mess and was more than a little scared by it all. And these were just my first thoughts from the unfolding madness. It only got worse as the days passed. I would personally advise you and your family to stay at the hotel, at least for today, Mr. Batterman suggested. Hopefully things will calm down, and people will eventually lose interest. I'll contact my head office and see what they suggest. The only problem with your plan is that we have dinner planned with my friend at Pella's restaurant, I explained. Mr. Batterman thought for a moment and then offered a solution. May I suggest you invite your friend here and have dinner with us? Our hotel has a 4-star restaurant and only seats 46, so it will be quiet and private. I told Mr. Batterman that his suggestion was great, and I would cancel my order and order a new one here. Please let me take care of this for you, he offered, and I agreed. I was still in shock from what was happening, and at this point, I couldn't even see what was happening outside. Mr. Batterman, may I ask you a question? I was hoping you would help me make sense of all this. Of course, I will answer everything I can, he replied. Why is this so important now? I mean, the kidnapping happened over 6 years ago. Okay, maybe the police got a little mixed up on the details, but does it matter? The prince was rescued and is safe and sound. Mr. Batterman thought for a moment and then smiled kindly. Mr. Adams, you are an American, so our royal family is more of a curiosity among your people than anything else. But for someone who is truly British, the monarchy is the foundation of our country. The nation was stunned when news broke that the Crown Prince had been kidnapped. The whole of Great Britain was plunged into a cloud of fear and sorrow. Then, when he was saved, the nation rejoiced as one. If you remember, the news of his safe return marked the beginning of 3 days of celebrations. Now, to know that you, sir, saved the prince and that you sought no recognition for your actions, you have captured the imagination and aroused the gratitude of this nation. All I can say is that every member of my staff considers it an honor to serve you in any way we can. Also, I want you to know that you will not pay for anything during your stay here at Langham. No, I can't agree with that, Mr. Batterman, I immediately protested. Our presence here is already causing you and your employees a lot of inconvenience. Mr. Batterman raised his hands. If it makes your sense of justice any better, I spoke to head office this morning, and they are thrilled with the free publicity. Bookings have already increased by more than 18%. When Mr. Batterman left, Grant and Louise came out of their bedroom. The breakfast Mr. Batterman left behind included bacon, eggs, bagels, Danish cheese, and oatmeal. I prepared plates for both of them and then sat them in front of the TV. I started the Toy Story movie for them. This was their favorite movie. Then it was time for me to make some phone calls. The first thing I did was call a family meeting. I woke up both grandparents and asked them to come to my room as soon as possible. I then called Sarah to let her know about the change in plans. When I called her, she picked up after the first ring. Michael, I can hardly believe what I see on TV. Is any of this true? She asked. Unfortunately, all of this is true, I confirmed. I'm sorry I wasn't honest with you about this, but the truth is that I wanted to put it all behind me. So that's why you canceled your dinner date with me? Sarah asked in such a voice that it sounded both like a question and a statement. Yes, I'm sorry that I deceived you, I apologized. But the British government agreed with me that it would be better if I left the country quickly and quietly. Is it true what they say about your injuries? They say you almost died. Are they exaggerating? Without exaggeration, all this is true. But there is nothing special about it. I wanted to change the topic about myself and move on to the topic of dinner that evening. Michael, this is very important, Sarah protested, and I thought she was angry with me, but she wasn't. I mean, you had to go through this whole ordeal alone and then come home and see how they kill your wife. At that moment, she began to cry. Please, Sarah, don't cry. I'm fine now. I just called to see if you would mind if we had dinner at the hotel tonight. All things considered, I understand if you don't want to come. I mean, the media has made this whole thing crazy here. I'll definitely be there tonight, Sarah said immediately. There's no way I'm letting you cancel another dinner because of me. See you at 6. When my grandparents arrived, I gave them the newspaper. Then I turned on the TV. All the news was only about me. I was beside myself with worry. I looked out the window at the front of the hotel and saw hundreds of people milling around. The police set up barricades and regulated the movement of people. The whole scene was surreal. When my mother was reading, she suddenly broke down and began to cry. This day got worse and worse. "What happened, Mom?" I asked with alarm. "You almost died, and you never told us about it," she sobbed. I regret it, but I felt it was best to keep it all a secret in case terrorists were behind the kidnapping. I didn't want them to go after anyone else in my family. Then when it turned out that they were not terrorists, I did not see the need to talk about it. I'm not sure my mother was happy with my explanation, but she accepted it. We met in my room before going down for dinner. Sarah looked stunning, and my parents were very interested in her. She easily charmed them and soon had them laughing at her stories of being the headmistress's assistant. Dinner got off to a very awkward start as the entire restaurant stood up and cheered when we entered. Then people started coming to our table to introduce themselves and thank me. I just smiled and introduced them to my family and Sarah as people continued to approach our table. Grant finally turned to me and asked, "Dad, are you famous?" "Probably yes," I answered, "but I don't want to be like that." It was at dinner that Sarah told me the first good news of the day. After explaining who I was, the school board approved 2 weeks of paid leave for her. Sarah will now be able to travel with us and be our guide. Now the only question was whether we could actually make the trip. Halfway through dinner, Mr. Batterman approached our table. "I offer my deepest apologies for interrupting, but can I talk to you, Mr. Adams?" I excused myself and followed the hotel manager to a quiet place near the kitchen door. There he looked around to make sure there was no one within earshot. "Mr. Adams, I contacted our head office," he began, and I was afraid that now we would be asked to leave. They had a pretty good offer. They thought it might dampen the media frenzy a little if you held an impromptu press conference tomorrow. We could organize it in our dance hall. Of course, the decision is entirely yours. I turned this sentence over in my head several times and liked it. I think this is a great idea. What do I need to do to set this up? Mr. Batterman smiled and shook his head. Absolutely nothing, we'll figure it out. I propose tomorrow at 10 in the morning. You just have to show up in whatever outfit you want. You should prepare a brief statement, and then we will give the press 30 minutes for questions. My parents and my wife's parents were very impressed when I told them about the press conference. My kids didn't care because they were waiting for their cake and ice cream. The next day, I have to admit that I was scared to death. I've never done anything even remotely close to this, plus I've never liked public speaking. At 9:50, Mr. Batterman led me into the main ballroom. I was stunned by his transformation. The back wall was decorated with American and British flags. Red, white, and blue garlands were hung throughout the hall, and the hotel orchestra was positioned to the right of the podium with the American and British flags crossed in front. As we walked towards the podium, I noticed hundreds of people gathered around with television cameras mounted at the back of the room. My legs felt like cotton as I walked down the center aisle. Suddenly, people started standing up and clapping. By the time I reached the front row, the sound was deafening. My family followed me and were shown seats towards the front row. My children's eyes were wide open, and they looked around the room in complete amazement. Both my mother and mother-in-law had tears running down their cheeks. When they were finally seated, my children were bouncing up and down in their chairs, asking one question after another to their grandparents. As we climbed onto the hastily constructed platform, the band began playing the Star-Spangled Banner, followed immediately by God Save the King. Mr. Batterman then walked up to the microphone and thanked everyone for coming. Then he gave me his word. I gave a short speech in which I let everyone know that I was grateful for the interest in me, but that I felt unworthy of it all. Then the questions began. They wanted to know everything that happened. One of the first questions was how I knew where the prince was in order to save him. I admitted I didn't even know he was a prince until I was in the hospital later. I then explained how I was hopelessly lost and was just hoping that some kind person could point me in the right direction. This caused laughter among seasoned journalists. They especially wanted to know details about the shootout. I didn't talk much about it, but I spent most of my time thanking the military who actually saved us. As I have already noted, if they had not arrived, I would have been dead, and perhaps the prince too. After Mr. Batterman thanked everyone for coming, reporters were still shouting questions as I walked out. I tried to answer the ones I could hear. Fortunately, I quickly left the hall and returned to my room. My children surrounded me, telling me about all the people who came to see me. The grandparents were in seventh heaven. Of course, when I planned this trip, none of us expected anything like this. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door. When I opened it, Sarah was standing there, smiling at me. I hugged her and thanked her for coming. She laughed. As they say in America, wild horses could not hold me, Michael. You were great. I was sitting in one of the back rows, and I had never heard the press speak so enthusiastically about anyone. They're usually a pretty jaded bunch, waiting for the next scandal. But they liked how you kept trying to put the credit on everyone else. They especially liked it when you talked about your deep respect and admiration for the prince and how courageous he was. Like I said, you were great. The next day, we were all invited to Buckingham Palace, even Sarah, which surprised me. It was during this visit that I learned something very important about Sarah. First, she was a close friend of the Queen. They went to school together. The second thing I learned was that her real name was Lady Sarah Smith. Her father was the Duke of something. I tuned out when Sarah started explaining her family history. It was too difficult. Finally, the next day we went on our tour to ensure our safety. The government provided a car with 2 security agents. Security was a must if we were going to travel. I thought this was all a waste of the guards' time, but Sarah insisted that we had protection, so I didn't make a fuss. Our first stop was Manchester. I've always been a big football fan. I even played on the high school team and the college team. Manchester United has always been my favorite professional team. I was hoping that maybe we could catch a glimpse of the field before driving around town. The Manchester club did much better when they heard that I wanted to take a look at the field. They organized a small reception at the stadium. There, I was taken out onto the field with my family and Sarah. I even met a few players. I was amazed at how kind everyone was to us. Our next stop was Liverpool, and luckily, it was a quiet visit since our schedule was not made public and the royal family asked the press to respect our privacy. We mingled with the crowd and had a wonderful time. From Liverpool, we continued north, stopping wherever Sarah thought we might like. I think because Sarah was a teacher, she was a wealth of information. It was so much more fun to have someone around who understood the history and significance of each place we stopped. We arrived in Glasgow and then Edinburgh, which we decided to make our home base. From there, we could take day trips wherever we wanted. Once again, we were able to move freely. The initial excitement died down, and I became yesterday's news. I was very happy about this. I can't for the life of me understand why anyone would willingly agree to become a celebrity. During this tour, I learned that not only was Sarah an excellent guide, but I was completely captivated by her. My parents and even my wife's parents quickly became very attached to Sarah, and the children were crazy about her. We started out as casual acquaintances and have now become close friends. Then one evening when Sarah and I were out for a walk, I realized that my feelings for her went much deeper. We stopped to look at Edinburgh Castle when, on a sudden impulse, I leaned over and kissed Sarah tenderly on the lips. She looked at me in surprise for a moment and then hugged me and kissed me passionately. We returned to her room, but I didn't know what to do next. Luckily, Sarah had her own ideas. She quickly began to undress me, and using this hint, I began to undress her. We both slid into her bed. As we lay looking at each other, she said, "Please don't hurt me. I will be very gentle." I assured her, "No, that's not what I meant." She said with fear in her eyes, "I know you like me, Michael, but I fell desperately in love with you. I'll still sleep with you, but if it's not serious, please tell me. It would hurt, but it would crush me if you left me later." "Sarah, when Carrie died, I thought I could never love another woman," I said softly. "You prove me wrong. I can't promise that everything will end happily, but I love you, and I feel so comfortable and peaceful when you're around." That was all Sarah wanted to hear. After that, she turned into a wild woman. She couldn't seem to get enough of me. At first, our lovemaking was wild passion, but then it became slow and gentle. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I slipped out of bed and returned to my room. I didn't want my family to know what Sarah and I were doing. However, I was kidding myself because the next day at breakfast, they were full of smiles and smug grins for both Sarah and me. The tour ended too quickly, and we returned to London. I arranged for my mother to look after the children, which gave Sarah and me the chance to spend our last night together. The day we left was filled with hugs, kisses, and tears. I think Sarah was terrified that as soon as I got home, I would forget about her. Over the next months, we talked every day, sometimes several times a day. The children loved it when Sarah called because she always had some funny and fantastic story to tell them. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore, so I flew back to London and asked Sarah to be my wife. She, of course, agreed. We then went to talk to her father, who I learned was the Duke of Stirling. Sarah's mother died several years ago. The Duke of Stirling, or Percy, as he asked his friends and family to be called, lived on the family estate. The house was huge, and the grounds were vast. Sarah explained that farming on the estate covered most of the expenses, but not all, so the Duke opened the family home for tours. The money from these tours made up the difference and provided the Duke with more than enough money to live on. "So, you want to marry my little Sarah?" asked the Duke with a smile. "Yes, sir, very much," I replied. "Do you know that her brother Edward will inherit the title and estates?" he asked, as if it might bother me. "Therefore, none of her children can have the title." "Sir, let me assure you that it makes no difference to me whether Sarah has a title or not," I replied with a smile. "I love her and want to make her happy. I know she would be very happy if you gave us your blessing. However, with your blessing or not, I intend to marry Sarah if she agrees to marry me." The Duke chuckled. "Excellent answer. I give my blessing with all my love." The wedding was modest, and yet it was larger than I would have liked. About 100 people were present, including the king and queen. Peter was also there with a charming young lady. He was now a teenager and was soon expected to marry and produce an heir. My father was my best man, and both of my children attended the wedding. Sarah and I honeymooned in Bermuda and then flew back to the UK. We decided that we would live in England during the school year and in America during the summer holidays. Grant and Louise entered Ludgrove. I realized that this was a school that many royal families sent their children to. Sarah also adopted Grant and Louise. When we lived in the UK, the Queen asked Sarah and me to carry out some royal duties from time to time. These included visiting the sick in hospitals, visiting various schools, or opening new factories. Sarah and I were greeted warmly every time we showed up. However, I have to admit that I was reluctant at first. But Sarah always made these walks fun for me, and each time, she rewarded me later that night in the bedroom, whether we were in the UK or the United States. Peter kept in touch with us. When he made an official trip to the United States, he wanted to stay with us, but his security team refused to consider it due to security concerns. Peter grew from a scared boy into a very confident, dynamic, and charismatic young man. I couldn't be more proud of him if he were my own son. 2 years after we got married, Sarah gave birth to a boy. She insisted on calling him Michael Jr. A year later, we had a girl, and we named her Charlotte. A year and a half later, another boy appeared, and we named him Thomas after my father. After all the pain and horror, my new life was wonderful. I felt truly happy. We are now approaching our 5th wedding anniversary, and we decided to celebrate with dinner and a show. I bought Sarah a gold necklace with 3 gold heart-shaped charms with the names and birth dates of each of our children written on the front. I hope she likes it. At dinner that night, I told my husband that I was pregnant again. I had a little girl, and I named her Mary after my mother. She has Michael's eyes and his smile. I have to stop because it's time to feed Mary. All I can do now is try my best for my children, especially because I know that's what my Michael wants me to do. God, give me strength. I still love him very much and miss him. Subscribe to our channel so that your second child doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one, *. What do you think of our story today? I think the story is exciting with an interesting plot. In this story, I was completely on my husband's side and completely justify his actions. What is your opinion? Write in the comments. Until new videos.